In this clip, we'll learn how to render out our scene into a final image. Okay, so you can see here inside my scene, I've already gone through the process of creating materials for each and every piece of geometry in my scene. Some of these materials actually have texture maps that are connected to them, as you can see here inside my viewport. Now, I've also begun the process of creating light sources in my scene. You can see I have a directional light right here. So I'm ready at this point to begin rendering out my scene. Now, what this means is that we're going to use Maya in conjunction with a rendering product like Arnold to sandwich our 3D scene into a 2D image. Now, this process includes the calculation of things like highlights and shadows, indirect illumination and reflections, and so on and so forth. All this happens when we render out our scene. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit to a feature you've probably noticed in my viewport here, and that's this little gray frame that surrounds my ship. This is something that I like to use when I start the rendering process because it details the renderable area pixel for pixel. Your viewport scale here doesn't always map to what is actually going to be rendered, so I like to enable this feature called the resolution gate, this gray frame, which tells me exactly what to expect inside my rendered images. You can turn that on under the View menu in the viewport if you come down to Camera Settings and Resolution Gate. You can also turn it on right here with this little button inside your viewport. I'm going to turn it off here, and you can see without the resolution gate and with the resolution gate on. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and render out this scene. I'm going to launch a single frame render here by coming up to my little clapboard icons, and we're going to click on this one that is blank. It looks like a little white clapboard. Now, when we do that, this window is going to pop open called the render view, and it may come up completely blue. That's okay. You can see here that fairly quickly with this scene, the image starts to appear from the center and works its way out. And what you can see here is based on all of the materials that I've defined, as well as the light sources, this is what we're receiving back inside of our render. Now, there are a number of things that you can do to make sure your renders happen very quickly when you're first beginning the rendering process. That's very, very important because you want to be able to go back to your materials and light sources and make changes and iterate quickly. You need that quick feedback. I'm going to point your attention to some information here below our render. You can see here the dimensions of the rendered image, this 712 by 400. And I know that sounds a little odd. We'll come back to that. You can see here the rendering plugin that I used to render out that image. You can see the frame number, the memory used, the sampling settings. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment, and the total amount of time that the render took. You can see my render actually happened very quickly at 4 seconds. Then lastly, the camera that I rendered through. Okay, great. So back to this strange pixel dimension that I'm using for my render, this 712 by 400. Now, rendering out a 3D scene can be very taxing on your computer. More accurately, your computer's CPU. Now, one of the best ways that you can manage that horsepower of your PC and give you quicker feedback is to render fewer pixels. Now, I don't need full 1080 resolution to be able to tell if my lights are too strong or not strong enough, and to tell if my materials are behaving under those lights the way I want them to. I don't need that type of resolution, so let me show you where we can change that. We're going to come over here to Render Settings, and there's 2 different places we can access this that are currently visible. One is going to be this little clapboard icon with the blue gear in the corner. And you'll notice that same button is right over here inside the render view. Let me go ahead and open that up here, and we'll quickly run through some of these settings on the Common tab. So the first area here is your file output. This is where you can tell Maya what type of image format to write out for your renders when you save them to disk. You can see by default mine is set to EXR. The next thing I want to point out to you is right down here. It's called the frame range, and this is going to be useful if you're rendering out an animation where you have multiple frames that you need to render. I'm not actually rendering an animation. I have a single frame here, but that's not why this area is grayed out. This is grayed out because of the frame animation extension. Right now, my file name .extension doesn't support a frame number. You can see it says single frame in parentheses. If we were to come in here and change this to one of these options that does support a frame number, maybe this one right here, you can see that the file name frame number .extension is the format that'll be used for our renders. But when I select that, you'll see here that this frame range and these options below become available to me. Let me just switch that back for the time being. I'm going to go back here to name.extension, and let's go ahead and move on. Now, this is an important setting here. If you're rendering out an animation or multiple frames, because the renderable camera is the camera that'll be used for all those frames. Now, with my scene here, remember, we're using a custom camera. So if I had multiple frames that I was wanting to render, we need to come in here and make sure we change this to the correct camera, or else we will likely render each one of those frames through the wrong camera and have to do the process all over again. Very important setting to remember there. Okay, down here at the bottom, you'll see the image size. Now, this is where you can control the pixel dimensions of your final rendered images. And you can see mine is set to that 712 value by 400. So you can start up here with a preset. You can come in here and maybe start with the HD 720 preset, or you can come in and start with even the HD 1080 preset. It really depends on what size you need for your final rendered images. Now, what I like to do is I like to come in again at this stage of the process and reduce this down, because I don't need to render this many pixels to see if everything is working as it should be. So I'll come in here and I'll check this maintain width height ratio box, and I'll come in and change one of these values to something like maybe 400 pixels, for example. When I hit enter here, you'll see that the width automatically adjusts because we've maintained that ratio. Okay, great. So this is how I set the pixel dimensions for my render. Now, I do want to point out to you the Arnold renderer tab here. Again, I'm using the Arnold renderer for this particular video. If you're using another rendering product, then you can select that from this drop-down menu here, or even right over here. Now, Arnold samples all of the things inside of our scene when we click that render button. And I don't want to dive too deep into this in this clip. We have a lot of great training on pluralsight.com that covers sampling with Arnold in quite a bit of depth. But just know that this is the quality of how Arnold calculates things like indirect illumination. It calculates the reflections. It calculates things like rays that go through transparent objects. There's a number of different ways that Arnold samples your scene, and that can be controlled right here. Okay, great. Let me go ahead and close out of render settings for right now. And I want to come back over here to the render view and show you a couple other useful things that you'll find as you begin this process of rendering. One of these is the ability to compare renders right here inside this window. Now, the first thing I'd want to do if I wanted to compare this render to one that I'm about to execute is I want to first keep this image. So we can tell Maya to keep this image by clicking on this button here. And there we go. You'll notice this little scroll bar appears down at the bottom. The one on the right is going to be the kept image. The one on the left here is the one that will be replaced with a new render. Let's go ahead and show you how that works. We'll go ahead and render again, but I want to make a change to my scene. Now, with the lighting in my scene, I have two main lights. I have a directional light, which you saw in the viewport, but I'm also using an Arnold specific light called a sky dome light. Now, this sky dome light has an image map to it and allows me to get a lot of this nice indirect illumination underneath our ship. I'm going to go ahead and hide this display layer called sky dome light. That layer actually contains that sky dome light. So as soon as I do that, I can come over here to my render view and click this button to render again. We'll go ahead and set off another render here, and you can see what our scene now looks like without the influence of that sky dome light. And we can scrub back and forth, and we can compare and contrast the two renders. Okay, great. Now, let's go ahead and turn that display layer back on here, because I want to show you another useful feature inside the render view called a render region. Now, again, this is in an effort to get quick feedback. Oftentimes, even reducing the pixel dimensions isn't enough for very heavy scenes, and it's still going to take a little bit of time to render. So if I wanted to, say, know what the front side of this ship right here will look like when influenced by the sky dome light, I can simply drag a rectangle around that here, and watch what happens. A little red rectangle shows up inside the render view. Well, what we have just done is we've defined a render region, and we can render out only the information inside this region simply by clicking on this little button here. I'll go ahead and click that, and you'll see here that briefly it turns blue, and then we get, after 1 second, feedback for this area that shows us what it looks like with the sky dome light turned on. Now we can clear this render region out by clicking away, just like so. And you can see here, there we go. We now have that little region that has that sky dome light turned on. Okay, great. So we've learned about render regions. Let's talk a little bit about the IPR render. This is a real strength of Arnold. We can turn on the IPR render, which provides instant feedback here inside the render view as we make changes inside of our scene. We can turn that IPR on by simply clicking this little clapboard with the IPR letters on top of it. And when we do that, you'll notice here that a render quickly takes place. And there we go. You can see, again, a 4-second render. Now, if I were to come in and make a change, for example, I hide that display layer again, we can come in and hide that. You'll see immediately that that light turns off inside of the render view because the IPR is turned on. If you ever have questions whether the IPR is turned on or not, you can just look for this little stop button right here. That little stop button can be clicked to actually stop the IPR, or the progressive renderer. I'll go ahead and click stop now. All right, great. Now, lastly, if we want to actually save this image out of Maya so we can use it in another application, for example, Photoshop, whatever the case may be, all we need to do is come up here to the File menu and choose Save Image. Now we can go to the options box here, and once you're here, you'll want to go ahead and choose to save the color managed image. That will make sure that the image that you save out of Maya looks exactly like the one that you see here inside of the render view. All right, great. So with that said, that's actually going to bring us to the end of our time together here in this Exploring Maya 2018 series. Hopefully you've learned a few things. If you're ready to take a deeper dive into Maya, I would definitely recommend checking out Maya Fundamentals over on Pluralsight.com. Thanks for joining us.